We are glad that you are here. I'm glad that I finally got all of this stuff to work. Thank heaven. Very glad about that. Yeah. So welcome. This week we are talking about something that's probably the most basic tool that you're going to use in the process of studying the Bible, and that is translations. So this is the most basic tool, again, and a good translation is sort of the basic foundational element of studying the Bible. So you want to make sure that you're using a good translation, and there are so many different versions of Scripture, from King James Version to New Century Version, the Good News Version, the New Living Version, Holman Christian Standard. I mean, you name it. New International certainly is probably, I would say, one of the most popular versions that we have. And so how do we know which one to use? Well, we're going to talk about that today. So here is the idea of what version of Scripture should I use? Well, it's probably a good practice to regularly read one main translation, provided it's a really good one. So if you're going to be reading the Bible on a regular basis, which you should, make sure that for the most part you're sticking with one version of Scripture. And that's why ahead of time you need to be doing some good footwork to figure out what it is that you want to use, which version of Scripture that you're wanting to use, so that on the regular you can be using that same version of Scripture all the time. That's just for reading. When it comes to actually studying the Bible, you should probably use several well-chosen translations. What that means is that you want different versions of Scripture that will say different things a little bit, and we'll get to what that means in just a second. But you want to have a couple different versions and translations of the text at your disposal while you are studying, and there's an important reason for that, one that we'll talk about soon. The best option when we talk about the different translation is to use translations that you know in advance are going to tend to differ a lot. Part of the reason that we want translations that are going to say things a little bit differently is because we need to have the full spectrum of interpretation. So last week we talked about the need to interpret and about how we have to engage the text and understand what it says. And every time we read something, whether it's the newspaper or whether it's the phone book, frankly, for that matter, we have to interpret what the original author's intent was, and we are processing that through a lot of different layers of understanding. There has already been a layer of interpretation made when it comes to Scripture, and that is the translator's interpretation of the original linguistic element into creating what it is that you have on the page there. So there's already been a layer of interpretation, and that's why it's important to, when you're studying Scripture, to have multiple versions of Scripture so that you can see what the individual differences are across a spectrum of translations. And so that is a really important thing to remember. So let's talk a little bit about the science of translation. Now, the first concern of translators is to be sure that the original Hebrew or Greek text they are using is as close as possible to the original wording as it left the author's hand. Obviously, we're wanting to make sure that what we are reading is what is actually intended by the author, and so we have to make sure that we're getting to that. But the problem is, there are lots of problems in how we make that work. Not the least of which is that there is not a singular original manuscript. There are thousands of copies produced by hand and copied repeatedly over a period of about 1,400 years for the New Testament and a whole lot more for the Old Testament. So we are trying to establish what is original out of a vast number of text, and that can be a little bit tricky. Another thing that's kind of difficult is that later manuscripts can differ a lot from earlier manuscripts, especially when we start talking about the New Testament, because you're going to see a lot of different changes and little things that have changed over years and over years and over years. It's sort of like later text can be a little bit more like playing a game of telephone. So we have to be very careful about the distance from the original text that we get when we start using different manuscripts. There are more than 5,000 Greek manuscripts for all or even just a part of the New Testament. That doesn't even include the thousands that appear in Latin. So Greek would have been one of the original languages for parts of the New Testament, and but it would have very quickly been translated into Latin, relatively quickly, I should say, in the grand scheme of time. It would have been translated into Latin pretty quickly, and so they're early enough manuscripts that the Latin ones can be a little bit reliable, but the problem is they're even a translation from the original Greek. So we're trying to get back to that original Greek understanding of what was written. So that kind of, you might be thinking, well, how on earth are we ever going to know if what we have is an accurate handling of the original text? That's a good question to be asking. Here's some of the things that we use. It's called textual criticism, is this entire study, so to speak, of how to get back to the original text. There are two different types of evidences for whether a text is a good text or not. There is external, which is the character and the quality of the manuscripts. So, for example, are they in good physical shape? Are they from a reputable source? Can we authenticate the text with timelines, things like that, dating to a certain place, where were they found, all that kind of stuff. Then there's the internal evidence, and this is how error-free are they. So, for example, I have some pretty atrocious handwriting when I'm going fast. My dad might argue that I have pretty atrocious handwriting all the time. But you know what? Some people say it's nice. That being said, there are times when it's hard to read handwriting. I know sometimes we'll get even prayer request cards and we'll kind of pass it around going, what does that say? We can't quite make out what it says. And so there might be just you're copying from one manuscript to another and the handwriting's difficult to make out, or it might even be something like, I put a comma where there should have been a period because I was going and just missed it, or I spelled a word incorrectly, or I added a letter. I mean, different things like that. So there are some mistakes that copyists might make that are something that we have to take into consideration. And one of the ways that they do that is by looking at the text very critically. So let's talk about the two different kinds. We'll start with external. So again, external evidence has to do with the quality and age of the manuscripts that support a given variant. And what we mean when we say that is, a lot of times you'll see scripture that is, there are original text variants. And so when we go back to the beginning, we look at what did the original say? What does this original say? And we can actually trace translations back to a certain variant because they all say the same thing. And there might be another original, or close to original, I should say, over here that has had series of copies made from it down this line, and we can trace back to that original. And so we have to go back to finding that where did this particular variation in a translation occur, or a variation in the actual document copy, I should say, rather than translation. The original document copy, where did that come from? Did it come from source A? Did it come from source B? And so we are looking at the quality and age of the manuscripts that support a given variant. Obviously, we want manuscripts that are as old as possible and as in good condition and good quality as possible. For example, when we're talking about the Old Testament, we are looking at Hebrew manuscripts preserved as the Masoretic text, Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Greek Septuagint. You'll see this Greek Septuagint thing a lot. It's denoted by the LXX of the Roman numeral type thing. That is the earliest translation of the Hebrew into the Greek that we have, and it was a big undertaking in the day, and we still have many of those texts available to us. When it comes to the New Testament, I can't talk today, guys. Sorry about that. When it comes to the New Testament, we're talking about manuscripts that are preserved in Egypt, where there were superior copying techniques. The Egyptians were really, really good at copying texts. They had it down. It was something that they were known for. And so if we have an Egyptian manuscript, that we know that that's probably a pretty good thing. Let's talk about internal evidence. This has to do with the copyists and the authors. So mistakes are determined by well-studied scribal habits and tendencies. If we know who the copyist was, or we can determine that this text and this text were copied by the same guy, we can sort of go back and look and go, what were their habits? What were their practices? Did this make sense to them? Do the errors make sense, I should say, rather, between A and B? Can we identify who this person is? And then can we say, well, this is clearly a mistake because when he did this, it was different, that sort of thing. Also, the variant that best explains how all the others came about is the one presumed to be the original text. So if we can, like I mentioned before, if we can take a text and say, this says this is translated a little bit differently, or this is copied, I should say, a little bit differently than the rest, we can follow that upward to find where it got the difference. So where did that start? Where did that variation start? It started 4 copies back, and we can look then and say, okay, when then we have this is the earliest manuscript that says that. How authentic is that manuscript? Where did the change come from? Is it an error? Is it an addition? That sort of thing. So that's what we're looking at as far as internal evidence. So what we're doing when we talk about textual criticism is that we're taking the best external evidence, combining it with the best internal evidence. And when we do that, we're able to have a pretty extraordinarily high degree of certainty about the original text. So we know that we can go back to a particular text and have a relatively strong idea that this was as close as we're getting to what the original intent is. That being said, textual criticism is not an exact science. There are so many human variables, and occasionally translators will even be divided amongst themselves as to which variant represents the original texts and which are scribal errors. I mean, again, there is the human element in translating all of this, and so that's why we have to be aware of what goes into a proper translation before we can decide on which translation that we're going to be using. Usually when there are differences between the translators, and a lot of times you'll see it's not just one person, 99% of the time it's not just one person translating an entire text, it's a group of scholars. And when there is differences that are found there, the majority choice is found in the actual translation, and you'll see a minority choice in the margin or in the notes somewhere in that scripture. You can see what that is. In the Holman Christian Standard, a lot of times if you're looking on like the YouVersion app on your cell phone, if you're looking at that app, you'll see like looks like a little speech box that's listed next to it, and you can tap that and it'll sometimes if there's a difference in the text translation, it'll say literally or something like that, and it'll tell you what that is. I'll tell you, it was fun. We were going through the story of David last week in church, and there was some in the Holman Christian Standard. There's some very interesting literal translations when it talks about David wanting to go in his anger and kill all the men for Nabal and Abigail's home, and what it literally says. If you're in the Holman Christian Standard, go look it up. It's great. I encourage you. It's I love the original sometimes. It's a lot of fun. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is something that can be pretty controversial for a lot of people. And if anyone ever talks to you about why this particular version of Scripture is the only right version of Scripture, hopefully this will encourage you to be able to have some resources to talk back about that. I will preface this by saying I grew up using the King James Version. The school that I went to, that I was in elementary school, was a good Baptist school, and they required the King James Version. It was the only acceptable translation that we could use. This was back in the 80s and 90s, and it was a different time then, right? We didn't have quite the knowledge of textual criticism in my little Baptist school that we do now. And so there are still a lot of pieces of Scripture that I know and I have memorized in the King James, and so I have a hard time kind of getting out of that. And so there is a fondness and a familiarity for me of the King James. That being said, let's talk about why the King James Version and the New King James Version have some issues. The King James Version for a long time was the most widely used translation in the world. For the New Testament, the only Greek text available to the translators of the 1611 edition was based on late manuscripts, which had accumulated the mistakes of over 1,000 years of copying. So what that means is, excuse me, by the time the translators of the 1611 edition of the King James Bible, which is the one that we all have, excuse me, by the time that happened, there were 1,000 years of mistakes, right? And this was before there was really this idea of textual criticism. Essentially, they were just taking original manuscripts and translating it into the English of the day. And you might be saying, well, the New King James is better. Well, no. It didn't take away any of the translation problems or the mistakes that were there. It simply got rid of all of these and the thous and the verilies and that sort of thing. It took out the archaic language, but it did not rid the translation of the original bad text. So that's as important. This is why for study, you should use almost any modern translation other than the King James or New King James Version. Like I said, if you like the King James and you want to read through it and you can wade through that, okay, it's not the best version and you probably shouldn't, unless you can get through some of the translation errors. If you like the poetry of the Psalms, for example, if you like the poetry of the Psalms in the King James, then by all means read it. I would not encourage it unless you're totally stuck. It's the only version of scripture you have available to you. Any other translation is going to be exponentially better. There are some people who will say that it's the only accurate translation. Let me be very clear. The King James Version is riddled not only with mistakes that come from 1,000 years of copyist errors, but it also is highly, highly, highly political. It was ordered by King James. That's why it's called King James. And the copyists had to toe a party line with some theology in order to make him happy. And so it is not an accurate translation by any stretch of the imagination, and it has a ton of errors. And so if somebody says to you, well, it's the only accurate translation, you'd be like, it's pretty much the only completely inaccurate translation. And I would encourage you to talk with them about that. So let's talk about the question of language, because we've talked about the these and the thous, but we haven't really talked about original text, English, all that jazz. There are a couple of issues that come into play when we talk about language in regards to Scripture. We have first the original language. That's, of course, the language that one is translating from. In Bible terms, that's going to be Hebrew for the Old Testament, and it's going to be Greek and a little bit of Aramaic for the New Testament in general. Or, again, you could go back and say that there's some Latin for the New Testament and the Old Testament if you're translating from the Septuagint. So that's another issue as well. However, Latin is also a receptor language. It's a language that one is translating into. So if you're translating from the Latin, it's already been translated once. So you're translating from a translation. Just keep that in mind. Then there is a historical difference, and that's the differences that exist between an original language and the receptor language. And we're going to talk about what some of those distances might be. There is a term called formal equivalence. Now, formal equivalence is the attempt to keep as close to the form of the Hebrew or Greek as can be conveniently put into understandable English. And you're like, what does that mean? Well, Greek in particular, let's just talk about Greek because it's probably the easiest one to talk about. Greek has a very different sentence structure than we have in English now. And it has a different type of formality. It has a different type of syntax. There are a lot of different words to describe. For example, you've probably heard this one, love. There are 4 different terms to describe the word love that we just have kind of like one term for. So we have to have some descriptors added in going back to that original text. And so when we have formal equivalence, that is this idea that we're trying to keep as close in English to the form of the original Greek or Hebrew. and it's as can be sort of conveniently put into understandable English. But there's a problem. The problem is that understandable English is not really the goal of good translation. The goal of a good translation is a, quote, contemporary English that is comparable to the original author's intent. So what does the English version say that will have the same sort of meaning that the original text or the original author would have intended? There is then this idea of free translation. Free translation, on the other hand, is this attempt to keep us close to the form of, I'm saying this incorrectly, to translate the ideas from one language to another with less concern about using the exact words of the original. We often will refer to this as paraphrase. Perhaps the most famous paraphrase would be the Message version. A lot of people have the Message version and like it because it's very modern and in today's English. I remember when I was in ministry, my very first ministry, I worked in the inner city in Long Beach, and someone dropped off a copy of a Bible that was designed to be used in, like, on the streets of the inner city, and it was awful. It was the worst paraphrase with the worst linguistic opportunity. It was so offensive because it was trying to speak in the way the kids these days speak, and it just it was hilarious and kind of offensive at the same time. That being said, translations like the Message are geared toward ideas as opposed to direct translations. The problem with that is that free translations can easily become too free. And so instead of reflecting the actual text, they reflect the ingrained perspective and biases of the original, or excuse me, of the translator, rather than reflecting faithfully how they are actually conveyed in the original text. And so if you have someone who's translating that into a paraphrase, they might have some preconceived ideas. They're actually, like, interpreting it and then giving you their interpretation, but it's much more interpretation than a stricter translation would be. Theory of translation has basically to do whether one puts primary emphasis on formal or on functional equivalency. So the idea is, do we want a translation that is much more formal and close to the original text, or do we want to convey the ideas? And different translations will fall somewhere on that spectrum between formal equivalence, which is like a very literal translation, and then functional, which is a very dynamic translation. And in order to help you figure out where your favorite translation may lie, here's a little bit of a chart that I've pulled from this book. It's a fantastic chart. We've got your King James and your New King James, which is a very literal translation and not always accurate. Obviously, we've already talked about that over here on the far formal side. And you've got translations like the Message, and the New Living over on the free translation side. And then right there in the middle, and you can kind of see, you've got translations like the New American Standard, Holman Christian Standard, NIV, that sort of thing. The translations that I like to use are ones that we will talk about a little bit later. We're going to pull that slide up, and I'll talk to you about some of my favorite translations here in a little bit. So literal versus free. A literal translation has some really good parts about it. It gives the reader confidence as to what the original language looked like. So when you have something that's very literal, again, you're looking back and seeing what the original manuscript said almost verbatim. The problem is that it really does keep distance at kind of the wrong places in language and grammar, as opposed to actual text, and can make the English ambiguous where it had been clear. So what that means is, in the original, there would have been no question about what the author said because everybody knew the syntax, the grammar, all that kind of stuff. When you bring it literally word for word into English, it can't be a literal word for word translation, because when it is so much equivalent like that, you sort of gain ambiguity, which is obviously the opposite of what we want. So that's one of the issues with a literal translation. When we talk about free translation, the good of that is that it has some really fresh and vivid ways of expressing some old truths. And these more free translations like the Message have really serve to stimulate contemporary Christians to take a new look. For me, that's one of my favorite ideas of a translation like the Message. For someone who's read through Scripture so much and so often over the years, if you've been in faith any length of time and you've read the Bible, there is a real tendency for it to become kind of stale, and translations like the Message can really help us take a fresh look at that. The problem with that, though, is that it really comes close to being a commentary, and it doesn't tell the reader that it's a commentary, and so you are really, really getting the interpretation of that translator as opposed to simply the word. Here's some problem areas to be aware of when we talk about translations. Weights measures money. So you'll hear things like ephah, bushel, things like that in Scripture. How do you know what the translation is? Do we go with a transliteration? Do you go with an equivalency? Something to consider. Different translations will handle it different ways. When it talks to euphemisms, because obviously throughout Scripture there are euphemisms used. Do you translate those literally, or do you translate them formally, or do you translate with equivalency? And so different translations will handle euphemisms in different ways as well. Vocabulary. Does the translation choose words that are both appropriate and not already filled with connotations that are foreign to the original language? In English, words are loaded. Words have a lot of context that we have created now that they might not have originally had. And so if we're using words that have a cultural connotation now, we have to be really careful that we're not obfuscating the original meaning, because we have some kind of preconceived idea of what it's supposed to mean in that moment. Another problem area here would be word plays. These sorts of things are almost always unique to the original language and can rarely be translated into the receptor language. So when we're talking about wordplay, what are we meaning? Let me pull up an example here. I like the example that they use here. For example, the play on the sounds for the word summer and end in Amos 1 and 2, where even though the Hebrew consonants sound very much alike and would have been pronounced virtually alike in Amos's day, translations that tend toward formal equivalence are going to translate it in a straightforward manner. God said, "Amos, what do you see?" And I said, "A basket of summer fruit." Then the Lord said to me, "The end has come upon my people in Israel." Well, that translation totally leaves out the wordplay that's intended, because summer and end are going to have the exact same sound. And so when you go back to, for example, like the NIV, what they have chosen to do is create a wordplay that would be an equivalent in English. For example, they translate it like this: "What do you see, Amos?" God asked. "A basket of ripe fruit," as opposed to summer in that other translation. "Then the Lord said to me, the time is ripe for my people Israel." So you can kind of see where those different things might occur depending on the translation that you use. One is going to be better than another. Hopefully that made sense. If you have questions about that, let me know in the comments and we'll do our best to answer those. Another problem area is grammar and syntax. Each language really has its own preferred structure as to how words and ideas are related to each other in sentences. Think back long ago to when you were in, like, I don't know, 4th grade, and you had to diagram sentences. If you were like me, you had to diagram sentences. I don't know if kids today have to do that. If not, they're getting off way too easy, because diagramming sentences was the worst. But you had your subject, and you had your predicate, and you had your direct objects and your indirect objects and your adjectives and your adverbs. You had all of these different parts of a sentence, right, that told us what everything was. Well, that's English. Different sentences and different languages structure their sentences differently. So for example, in English, we typically will put the descriptive term before the noun. So she is a curly-haired girl, right? In Spanish, they'll put that descriptor after the noun, right? So you have and I don't speak Spanish very well, so I apologize. But you would say, like, she has dark hair, morena would be the term that would come after that, the niña, right? Niña morena. I'm guessing. Please help me for those of you who speak Spanish, because I probably just butchered that. But you get the idea. The descriptor comes after the noun in Spanish. And in Greek and Hebrew and Latin and all these other languages, they have different syntax as well. So we have to make sure we are properly relating different parts of a sentence to the correct other part of the sentence, right? So we have to play a little bit of Jenga and Tetris with that to make sure we're doing it correctly. So let's talk also about matters of gender. And this has kind of been a hot button subject more recently because the new translation of the NIV, they've gone back and redone the NIV back in 2011. We were running off of, I think it was from 84 was the last translation that the New International Version had. And in the 2011 edition, they went in and they changed gender to be more inclusive gender, and people kind of lost their minds about it. What they were trying to accomplish was, in the original, there used to be this understanding of men was an equivalent for mankind, for all of mankind, right? We don't say that anymore. We are much more gender specific in modern times and in modern English. And so in the NIV 2011 version, they've gone in and changed these genders to be much more gender inclusive, not as a way to alter the original text, but as a way to get back to a more clear meaning of the original text. So again, let's go back to kind of the main takeaway for what I hope you are getting out of this translation thing. And I know that translations can be a little bit dry, and I'm kind of booking through the text, but I want to give you just a quick overview. And again, I do encourage you to get this book to really dive in a lot deeper for study of Scripture. But for the study of the Bible, you should use several well-chosen translations. And the best option is to use translations that one knows in advance will tend to differ. What that means is, if we go back to that spectrum that we talked about earlier, you'll see that there are some that are formal equivalent, some that are free. I like to use translations that go across the spectrum. And so if I'm looking at a particular piece of Scripture and I want to get a the full breadth of what it is saying, I'm going to choose a couple different translations. And these are the ones that I'm going to spend the most time in. On the far left, you'll see HCSB. It sort of bridges the gap between formal and functional. And the Holman Christian Standard is, I think, a really great translation to get some more of that formality back that I remember from my youth in the King James. It feels a little bit more familiar to me, and I feel like it has a much more literal translation, which I want sometimes. For everyday daily reading, I like the NIV. You'll notice that there's two there. There's the 1 and 2. 1 references the 1984 edition, 2 references the 2011 edition. I think either of them are appropriate. Most of the time now, you're going to have a hard time finding the 84 edition unless you're getting it secondhand. So you're going to be seeing the 2011 edition, particularly if you have the Bible app, or if you go on any of those study resources like we talked about last week, which my favorite is studylight.org, studylight.org. I love that particular site for study. Because they just have a really good selection of Scripture, and they have a really good selection of languages, and they have a really good selection of study aids, which we will talk more about later. And then over on the free side of things, I love the New Living Translation and the New Century Version. I think where they particularly shine, and this is something that I think can be said of the Message version as well, where they shine for me as, like I said before, as someone who went to Bible college and had the Bible as a textbook, and had the Bible as a textbook really all of my schooling years. I was in Christian school from the time I was in kindergarten all the way through college. So I had a lot of Bible time. And after a while, when you have Scripture as a textbook, and this is something they talk about at Christian college a lot for kids going in, it becomes really easy for the Bible just to become another textbook, and to lose that gravitas and to lose that feeling of importance in your life. And so for me, one of the reasons that I really love reading through the NLT and the New Century is because it freshens it up for me a little bit. It brings the text to life, particularly a text that I've read a dozen times. It helps me to see it in a new light and a new freshness because I'm seeing a little bit more loose translation of it. And if I'm particularly stuck, that's when I'll use the Message, because it's a much more poetic, very, very contemporary paraphrase, and that helps me take away some of the preconceived ideas that I have placed around that particular passage of Scripture, and it helps me look at it with a fresh perspective. And so, again, my favorite translations are these: the Holman Christian Standard, the New International Version, the New Living Translation, and the New Century Version. You'll see some others that are in there, like GNB. That's the Good News Bible. That's a translation that came out in, I want to say, the late 60s, early 70s. It's actually a surprisingly good translation. You might think by the name that it's one of those weird hippie translations. It's actually pretty good, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. On the far right, you have the Living Bible, which is really very free and not really one of my favorites. I think it takes a little bit too much liberty with the text. But yeah, so these are some translations that I would encourage you to take a look at. And if you have any questions about what we've talked about as far as translations go ahead and leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Hopefully this video helped, and first off, this video worked. I can't tell you how frustrating it's been to try and get the technology working. But I'm glad that we are able to meet like this, and I'm glad that this has worked out. So thanks for spending your lunch break with me, and we will see you next week. Next week we're going to be talking about diving into scriptures. We're actually going to get into how to study parts of scripture, and that's going to be really important. So stick around next week as we talk about starting the Old Testament. All right? Have a great week, my friends. I will see you on Sunday, and then we'll see you back here again next Wednesday at 12:15. Bye.